Maybe we better make sure the listeners are up to date on what the genetic fallacy is. Why don't you explain it, Ken?
Why don't you explain it, Brian, since you're being accused of it?
Okay.
Right. Well, I'm not. Only Nietzsche is, right? The genetic fallacy, and Nietzsche was well aware of it and was very careful to say he was avoiding it. The genetic fallacy is the thought that you've shown something about the truth of a belief by showing us something about its origin. And Nietzsche is very keen to say that the origin of a belief is one thing, its truth or value is another. And that, of course, then raises the question, why did he write a history or genealogy of morality? And I take it you could think of it this way, in very simple terms, which is that if you learn that your beliefs were arrived at the wrong kind of way, that ought to make you suspicious about them, right? If it turns out that I recommend a particular restaurant to you, and then it turns out I'm part owner of the restaurant, that raises a question about whether my recommendation of the great food at this restaurant is really credible. And I take it that's what Nietzsche's after. He wants to say, look where morality came from. And where it came from isn't so wonderful. Maybe you ought to rethink your commitment to it. But that leaves open the question whether it's really true, whether we ought to accept it, and so on.
Okay, I think that's a nice response. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. Our guest is Brian Leiter from the University of Texas at Austin, author of Morality on Nietzsche. John, you wanted to respond, I think, to
Well, I agree with Brian's question, Brian's answer to the astute question. I think in general, although the genetic fallacy is a fallacy, that still the genesis of an idea can sometimes be illuminating. It's not the fact that an idea has a kind of a funny psychological or even psychoanalytic or even nutty origin doesn't mean that it's false, but it may help us to understand the idea better and may help us to understand what some other good argument against it might be.
Well, that's right, but there is this distinction between how you come across an idea or a thought and how you confirm it or disconfirm it. I mean, Copernicus, just couldn't stand to see that the sun was not at the center of things because he was some kind of sun worship or something. But that doesn't make the thought that he had that the earth goes around the sun false.
But if you think the origin of your view is that it came pretty directly from God by way of the Bible or a priest.
That's true.
Then somebody says, no, actually, it's just a herd morality idea that was a response to the situations in the Roman Empire. That can affect your view of its validity.
We have lots of callers, again, from all around the country. Arpan in Austin, Texas, from where you hail, Brian. Welcome, Arpan, to Philosophy Talk.
Good afternoon, Dr. Leiter.
Good afternoon.
Sir, in Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche remarks that there are no moral phenomena, but there are only moral interpretations of phenomena. Could you explain what role interpretation plays in Nietzsche's view of normative theory?
Thanks, Arvin. I think this is one of your fans or something.
Yeah, let's make sure, Brian, you explain normative theory on your way to answering this.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, well, that, of course, is a big question. When Nietzsche says that there are no moral phenomena, there are no moral facts, there are just moral interpretations, what he means specifically in context of that remark, but it illustrates the point more generally, he means that people interpret the behavior of other human beings as though it makes sense to view them as morally responsible for what they do, because they have free will. In fact, Nietzsche thinks people don't have free will. People aren't free enough such that they can be responsible for their actions. Therefore, to interpret them as morally responsible is to impose an interpretation that the facts of the case don't warrant.
Yeah.
And that's often the way Nietzsche looks at things. He says, on the one hand, there's a correct naturalistic explanation for what's going on, what human behavior is really like, what its sources are. And then on the other hand, there are these moral and religious interpretations we impose upon the natural phenomena which misdescribe it.
So we're getting some really interesting phone calls here. Our number is 415-841-4134. Brian, I want to just go back to the theme of the Goethes and the Supermen and so forth. Now, you're in a philosophy department that's no doubt a bunch of really nice men and women that never have a harsh word for each other. But many of us in philosophy occasionally meet, or maybe I should say the humanities, maybe I should say in academia, occasionally
maybe you should say
meet,
in life.
Yeah, well, maybe not, but occasionally meet self-satisfied, self-important, pompous twits who kind of think that they should be treated as Nietzschean supermen. Somebody else should clean up after them. Someone else should do their Xeroxing and so forth and so on. Now, how does one of us who feels like that, what test can we have to know whether we really are a Goethe that ought to break the rules or just another slob that ought to pay attention to him?
Now, this is really a question for applied Nietzsche's moral
Absolutely.
philosophy, which is an undeveloped discipline.
Well, we're developing it right here.
Yeah.
Nietzsche has an answer, right? Nietzsche's answer is, can you will the eternal return? All right, this is one of Nietzsche's, again, very famous doctrines. It's actually one that was important to him. All right, Nietzsche says, can you live in such a way that you would be willing to have your life repeated over and over again, exactly in every detail? And if you're living in such a way that you'd be willing, that you could tolerate the thought of having the whole thing occur again and again and again, then you are living the life of Nietzsche's higher human being.
But that's not a very good test, because if I'm a schmuck, to put it in crude terms, I could, I lord it over everybody, and they all resent me and hate me, but I think, wow, this is pretty cool. Then I could will it over and over again, but nobody else would will it over and over again. I mean, what's that the test of? That's just a test of my self-satisfaction.
That's whether you're a schmuck or a schlemazel, as it was explained to me, but I probably got the pronunciation
I don't
wrong.
quite see what that would be a test of, Brian.
Right. Well, I think you're right. I think you're right that it couldn't be the sole criterion, though Nietzsche often talks as though it's the most distinctive one. I suppose we'd have to question whether our self-satisfied schlemiel, as you put it, really could be so self-satisfied that they could bear the thought of the eternal return. I think the reality, of course, is that self-satisfied schlemiels are often self-satisfied on the surface and deeply worried underneath the surface.
Yeah.
But that's a question. This is armchair psychology, and I probably can't do much better than that.
Okay. Rigoletto in San Francisco is on the line. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, Rigoletto.
Hi, good afternoon. I just have an observation to make concerning your earlier remarks about suffering. Pardon me, I got a cold.
Are you on a cell phone?
No, I'm not. But
Your connection's a little bad, so please
But
speak up.
but you are suffering with a cold, so it's a very appropriate question.
I had thought, I read him many years ago, but I had thought that he meant by suffering that being in the company of people who suffered, whether from illness or for other reasons, could corrupt an aristocratic personality. But I have another question as well. If you want to respond to that, that's fine. But my other question was kind of in two parts. Is it true that one or more of his texts, as published, were possibly corrupted or altered by his sister? And secondly, what translation is considered the better one in English? I'll take an answer on the air. Thank you.
Okay. You've asked three questions there. Brian, you want to respond quickly to those three questions?
Sure. On the first point, it's certainly true that Nietzsche thinks that pity for the suffering can be damaging. Why he thinks that is a complex psychological story we probably shouldn't go into. But he also thinks that suffering itself is a good thing. If you read his autobiography, he has nothing but gratitude for how much he himself suffered. He had terrible physical health problems throughout his life, and he thought it was an enormous stimulus to his own creativity. On the question of Nietzsche's text, there's a well-known book called The Will to Power, which was compiled after his mental breakdown by his sister and a friend. It is a non-book, as people often say, that it isn't a book he intended to write. He didn't intend to write a book called The Will to Power. It simply collects material that was in his notebooks.
And I understand that's where the charge of anti-Semitism and all that stuff gets going, right, from the Nazi reading of that text or something. Am I right about that?
It's not. That text certainly played a role. There's a more complex story. His sister took control of his estate. His sister was a proto-Nazi and anti-Semite. She issued very selective editions of all his works to emphasize themes sympathetic to German nationalism. She had to purge, for example, all the stuff where Nietzsche disparages Germans, because the one group of people that Nietzsche really hated were Germans.
Yeah,
so all of that had to get cut out of the corpus.
We have Brian. We have callers calling in from all over the country, and I want to give them a chance to get in here. We have Aaron from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, on the line. Aaron, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Hello, thank you for Philosophy Talk.
Thank you.
I have a question. Like Nietzsche describes in, I believe it's in the Genealogy of Morals, about the revolt of slave morality as describing the rise of the Judeo-Christian ethic. I'm wondering, was there not, or perhaps it was very subtle. Was there a slave morality in the American history of slavery? And when they were emancipated, did it come to the surface and become sort of a master morality as a result?
Thanks, Aaron. I'm not sure, Brian, but I take it slave morality in Nietzsche is the morality of sort of democratic egalitarianism. Am I not right about that?
Well, I think he thinks the morality of democratic egalitarianism arises out of a morality that in the first instance was genuinely a morality of slaves. Mm-hmm. And he's referring to a simple historical fact, namely that Christianity first took hold in the oppressed classes of the Roman Empire.